Well, welcome, church, to our study on Passover. Really excited to share with you the prophetic nature of this. When you look at the history and everything that's involved, you just discover, wow, God really knows what He's doing. So we're going to just dive right in. I'm actually going to start in Exodus chapter 12, where we first get introduced to the Passover. And it says this: The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, "This month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of the month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with the nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the people of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood, put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the house where they are to eat the lambs. That same night they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with the bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or cooked in water, but roast over the fire, head, legs, and inner parts. Do not leave any of it until morning. If some is still left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you are to eat it: with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both man and animal, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt." So this is the first part of that we see of Passover in the Bible. And on the 10th of the month of Nisan, which they said are supposed to be the first month of the year, on the 10th of the month, they're to go pick a lamb, bring it home, and care for it for the next 3-4 days. Inspect it to make sure it doesn't have anything wrong with it, so it can be a pleasing sacrifice and offering. And I mean, if it's like my house, you bring a lamb home that's a year old. The kids are going to play with it, see if it'll play fetch. They're going to name it. They're going to fight over whose room it's going to sleep in. And it would be a nightmare to try to figure out how we're going to sacrifice this thing. I'm sure there was plenty of challenges with that over the years. So they selected on the 10th of Nisan. On the 14th at twilight, they take it and they have it sacrificed. Not sacrificed on the altar. They have the priests kill it. They drain the blood, and then they give the lamb back to the people so that they can roast it for their Passover meal, and take the blood and spread it on the door frames, so the angel of death will pass over. And most everyone's aware, the symbolism of the Passover of death with the blood on the cross, so that our sins are forgiven, so that we don't have to face that death. It is incredible. It's like 1,000 years of this written earlier, so incredibly prophetic. In fact, I looked at it today. The oldest copy, the whole copy of Exodus that we have, is actually written in the 1300s, but we have lots of fragments and parts of Exodus, and most of them you find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In fact, this whole chapter we read of Exodus, almost every verse is in. I looked at those fragments and what there is, and everything in our reading today is actually in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which have been dated to be about 250 years before Jesus was born. So the prophetic nature and the prediction of what this is all pointing to on the cross is amazing. And we're going to look at more than just the Passover. But with Passover, right now, things changed over the years. You have the original Passover here that Moses is declaring for the people of Israel. And then you enter into the king period. You have King Saul and David. Solomon built the temple, and it changed everything with Passover. So now Passover becomes a pilgrimage feast, because the only place that you can celebrate, and the only place you can bring the lamb to, had to be the temple in Jerusalem. So once you get to Solomon's era, everyone from all around Israel comes to Jerusalem so that they can bring their Passover lamb, so that they can celebrate this feast. Then after Solomon, you had kings that didn't follow God's commands, and they didn't encourage Israel to do so, so they steered away from it. You find in 2 Chronicles 30, Hezekiah reinstating Passover as a national feast, and then the same thing in 2 Chronicles 35, where Josiah does the same, where they read the book of the law, it convicts them and says we need to follow this, and so they started following Passover at the appropriate times. Then the temple gets destroyed, and so in 70 AD, not in 70 AD, but for 70 years, the people get taken out of Jerusalem. There's no temple to be able to follow these commands to do the Passover meal. So it changed there. Then they come back and they're able to rebuild the temple with Ezra and Nehemiah and get things back on track. So Jesus celebrates the Passover with his disciples. Now there's a thing called the Passover Seder, which is a Seder meal. That starts happening later. We're about 70 AD when the Romans destroyed the temple. They weren't able to do the Passover lamb. They created the Seder dinner. The next video I do is going to explore the prophetic nature of that. Even though that's not prophetically speaking forward, it's still, the Seder dinner is still pointing towards Christ and everything. So you have this event that Jesus celebrated with his disciples, but it looks different than what we have now, and we're going to get more on the Seder later. But Passover was a 7-day period. You'd have the 10th where they select the lamb, the 14th where they would slaughter the lamb and they'd eat it that night for their Passover dinner, and then the next day is another feast. That feast is called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Unleavened bread was a reminder for them of the haste of leaving Egypt. They didn't have time to let the dough rise with yeast, so they made the more like a cracker bread that they were able to make, and it didn't spoil. It lasted for the whole week, and they were able to eat on the run. So it's also, though, the Bible also jumps in and talks about the yeast being symbolistic with sin. Jesus criticized saying a little yeast goes a long ways through the batch, talking about the Pharisees, and the Apostle Paul jumps on to this in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Apostle Paul talks about the significance of unleavened bread and Passover in verses 6 through 8. He says, "Your boasting is not good. Don't you know that a little yeast works through the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old yeast, that you may be a new batch without yeast, as you really are. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us keep the festival, not with the old yeast, the yeast of malice and wickedness, but with the bread without yeast, the bread of sincerity and truth." So the Apostle Paul's looking at this and seeing that the unleavened bread is very symbolic of a sin-free, pure lifestyle instead of going to our old sinful nature lifestyle. So that was celebrated on the 15th of Nisan. Again, the 14th started Passover that night. The 15th started the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And if you read through John's gospel, it clearly talks about how this laid out for Jesus. In John chapter 18, verse 28, it says, "Then the Jews led Jesus, after Jesus was arrested the night before, and they tried him and held him all night long. Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat Passover. So Jesus was arrested the night before, and now it's the 14th of Nisan, and that night they're going to celebrate Passover. The Jews, if they go into the Gentile palace, they would be unclean. The Jewish leaders, they didn't want to do that, so they stayed out, and they had Jesus escorted in before Pontius Pilate. The Bible does say, though, if in Exodus 12 that if someone is unclean during Passover, that they can wait a month. And the next month at the same time, they would be able to celebrate Passover. But let's be real. Christmas comes December 25th. If I turn to my kids and say, hey, we're not ready for this yet, let's do it in another month from now, it would not fly well in my household. No one wants to put Christmas off a month. No Jew wanted to put Passover off a month, so they wanted to remain clean. Pilate sentenced Jesus and is handing him back off to the Jews, or handing him off so he could be crucified. In chapter 19 of John, verse 14, it says, it was a day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. So the next day after, on the 15th in the sun, there's no work, not supposed to do any work at all. So to prepare for the Passover, you do it all on the 14th, and that's what's saying here, that they're preparing for the Passover, and they handed Jesus over to be crucified. Later on in chapter 19, verse 31. Verse 31 says, now it was a day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath, because the Jews did not want their bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath. They asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. Of course, they didn't do that with Jesus. They speared him in the side because he was already dead. But it talks about a special Sabbath. And what is a special Sabbath? It happens occasionally because Passover doesn't follow our Gregorian calendar, like you'd have December 25th being Christmas every year. They follow it more of a lunar calendar. Passover is always going to be a full moon. And so it could be it could be a Wednesday, it could be a Tuesday, it could be a Thursday, it could be a Friday. So Passover could be all over the place as far as the day. So in this situation, John's telling us that Passover happened on Friday. That Friday night, it started Friday night, and then Saturday was going to start the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was also a Sabbath, which made it a special Sabbath, so that it was just a doubly honored day of a celebration and also of rest. So Jesus was crucified on Passover night. The next day, while he's in the tomb, they're celebrating the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But there's another feast that's talked about in Leviticus 23 that isn't necessarily something that is celebrated anymore, because you actually have to have the priests in the temple to be able to do the ceremony, and that's called the Festival of First Fruits. Again, people don't hear about it much because it can't be celebrated anymore. But in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 9, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites, say to them, when you enter the land, I'm in the wrong place. Let's start with verse 4. These are the Lord's appointed feasts, the sacred assemblies you are to proclaim at their appointed time. The Lord's Passover begins at twilight on the 14th day of the first month, a month in the sun. On the 15th day of that month, the Lord's Feast of Unleavened Bread begins. For 7 days you must eat bread without yeast. On the first day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. For 7 days, present the offering made before the Lord with fire. On the seventh day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. Then it goes into 9. Then the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I'm going to give you and you reap its harvest, bring to the priests a sheaf of the first grain you harvest. It is to wave the sheaf before the Lord, so it will be accepted on your behalf. The priest is to wave it on the day after the Sabbath. On the day you wave the sheaf, you must sacrifice a burnt offering to the Lord, a lamb, a year-old, without defect, together with its grain offering of 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, an offering made to the Lord by fire, a pleasing aroma, and its drink offering of 1/4 of a hin of wine. So, 14th you have the Passover. That night, on the 15th, you have unleavened bread, and then the first day after the Sabbath, which is Sunday, and for us here is Easter Sunday. It's the Feast of First Fruits, where people would bring their first of their grain offerings to the Lord and mix that with the sacrifice of another lamb to just bring a fragrant, pleasing aroma to the Lord. So it's really an amazing week. On the 10th, they select their lamb. The 10th, by the way, in Jesus' time was the triumphal entry, Jesus coming into Jerusalem on the 10th. And they bring their lamb home and they'd inspect it for the next 3 days to make sure it's acceptable. When Jesus came into Jerusalem, the next 3 days, the 11th, the 12th, and 13th, he got bombarded with questions from the Pharisees and tested. And it says that they stopped asking him questions because he stumped them. They couldn't find any fault in what he was saying, so they let it be, and they sat back and devised other plans. On the 14th, Jesus was arrested on the night of the 13th, on the night where the 14th began, and then all day was held overnight. At 3 o'clock, it says that he was put on the cross, and at 3 o'clock, here's what's really interesting with the Passover, is at 3 o'clock in the afternoon is when the temple opened, and the priests would blow the shofar to let everyone know that the temple is now open to bring their Passover lambs to be killed, so that they can eat those Passover lambs for dinner. So while Jesus is on the cross, was the exact same time when the people were bringing their lambs to be sacrificed into the temple. Of course, this is very symbolic, very prophetic to what's actually going on here. So at 3 o'clock that happens. Jesus dies on the cross. They put him in the grave before sunset, so that before the Sabbath starts. And then the next day he's in the grave during unleavened bread. And then on the Feast of First Fruits, when they do a wave offering and the offering of the first of their crops to the Lord, is when Jesus resurrects. The propheticness, the pinpointed accuracy of what God is doing here is really incredible. And thus, with the blood on the cross, death is able to pass over those who accept Jesus and can experience God's full plan that is just as detailed as what he put into place here 1,000 years earlier than Jesus' time. So we're going to end this video and look at the Seder dinner next, and Seder meal, which again points to Jesus, just kind of in a different direction. And just have yourself a fantastic Easter, but realize this: man, God's plan's amazing, and he knows exactly what he's doing, and we can fully trust him. Thank you.